There is a moment after betrayal that almost nobody talks about. It is the moment when the person who caused the damage finally realizes that the person they thought would always be there has truly disappeared. At first, the avoidant may feel relief. The pressure is gone. The difficult conversations are gone. The emotional responsibility feels lighter. They may convince themselves that walking away was freedom. They may even believe that another relationship, another distraction, or enough distance will erase what happened. But there is a deeper psychological reality hiding underneath that relief. Emotional distance can postpone pain, but it cannot protect someone from the consequences of their choices. And sometimes the consequence arrives long after the betrayal itself. In this video, we are going deeper than the usual story of an avoidant person losing someone and suddenly coming back. We are going to uncover what can happen inside the mind of someone who pushes away genuine love, breaks trust, and believes they can simply move forward without confronting what they have done. You will learn why some avoidant people can appear completely unaffected after hurting someone they once cared about. You will discover why emotional detachment can sometimes look like confidence, when underneath it there may be suppression, fear, or an inability to process emotional vulnerability. You will also learn why the absence of a deeply understanding partner can become more powerful with time, especially when the person realizes that emotional safety is far harder to replace than physical attraction. There is another, lesser-known part of this story. Sometimes the person who betrayed you does not immediately understand what they lost because the mind can protect itself through emotional distance. When closeness begins to feel threatening, a person may focus on the reasons a relationship feels difficult, instead of confronting the emotional needs underneath that discomfort. This can create a strange pattern. The person leaves because intimacy feels overwhelming, feels relief because the emotional pressure has disappeared, and only later begins to recognize the value of the connection they walked away from. By then, the person they betrayed may have changed completely, and this is where the story becomes more painful. The person they thought they could replace may have been giving them something they rarely found elsewhere: patience without control, closeness without suffocation, understanding without judgment, and emotional safety without demanding perfection. They may have mistaken that patience for weakness. They may have believed that forgiveness meant unlimited access. They may have assumed that because you loved them deeply, you would eventually return. Then one day, the messages stop, the explanations stop, the waiting stops. You stop trying to convince them to understand your pain. Suddenly, the person they believed they could always reach becomes the person they can no longer reach. By staying until the end of this video, you will understand why that shift can become such a powerful psychological turning point. We will explore the difference between missing someone and being capable of loving them properly. We will uncover why regret can appear long after the relationship has ended, why finding another partner does not automatically erase old attachment patterns, and why returning to someone is meaningless without genuine accountability and behavioral change. Most importantly, you will learn why their eventual realization should never become the measure of your worth, because this story is bigger than an avoidant losing someone. It is about what happens when emotional avoidance finally meets reality. It is about the hidden cost of betraying someone who offered genuine love. And it is about the moment you stop waiting for another person to recognize your value and begin recognizing it yourself. Welcome to our channel, where we explore psychology, emotional healing, relationships, and the patterns that shape human behavior. If you want to understand the hidden psychology behind difficult relationships and learn how to protect your emotional well-being, subscribe to the channel and stay with us until the end. Because sometimes the person who walks away first only understands what they lost after the person they betrayed has already learned how to live without them. The betrayal may have looked like a simple ending to them. They may have believed they were making a choice, closing a chapter, and stepping into a life where they would finally feel free from emotional pressure. Perhaps they told themselves that the relationship had become too complicated, that they needed space, or that being with someone else would make everything easier. From the outside, their behavior could look strangely calm. While you were trying to understand how someone you trusted could cross such a painful line, they may have appeared ready to move forward without looking back. That difference can be deeply confusing. You are left carrying the emotional weight while they seem to be carrying almost none. For someone with strong avoidant tendencies, emotional distance can become a way of managing discomfort. When intimacy becomes intense, the person may begin focusing on everything that feels wrong about the relationship. Small problems can suddenly feel enormous. Emotional conversations can feel exhausting. A partner's needs can feel like demands. Closeness can create an urge to escape. This is where psychologists often discuss deactivating strategies. Instead of moving closer to attachment needs, the person creates psychological distance from those needs.
They may suppress emotions, minimize the importance of the relationship.
Or convince themselves that they never needed the connection as deeply as they actually did. That can create a dangerous illusion. If they can make themselves believe that the relationship was the problem, then leaving becomes easier. If they can convince themselves that they are better alone, then betrayal becomes easier to justify. If they can immediately find another source of attention, then they can avoid sitting with guilt, grief, and vulnerability. The mind has a remarkable ability to protect itself from emotional discomfort. Sometimes that protection comes through distraction. Sometimes it comes through rationalization. Sometimes it comes through emotional shutdown. The part they may have failed to recognize was the actual role you played in their life. You were not simply someone who occupied a romantic position. You may have become the person who understood their silence. You knew when they needed space without immediately assuming they had stopped caring. You allowed them to retreat without turning every moment of distance into a battle. You gave them room while still remaining emotionally present. That kind of connection can become almost invisible when someone has grown accustomed to it. A person can become so comfortable with emotional safety that they stop recognizing it as something valuable. Your patience may have felt ordinary because it was always there. Your understanding may have felt effortless because you rarely demanded recognition for it. Your ability to forgive may have made them believe another chance would always exist. They may have confused your willingness to understand them with an unlimited willingness to tolerate anything. This is where betrayal becomes psychologically different from an ordinary relationship conflict. A conflict can sometimes be repaired through honesty, accountability, and changed behavior. Betrayal attacks the foundation that makes emotional closeness possible. Trust begins to feel unsafe. The person who once represented comfort becomes connected with pain. And the avoidant may initially escape the emotional consequences because distance gives them relief. They can step away from the relationship and step away from the feelings attached to it. But emotional distance does not erase attachment needs. It simply changes how those needs are experienced. The person may continue living as though nothing important has happened. They may work, socialize, pursue another relationship, or fill their days with distractions. Yet certain memories can remain underneath the surface. A familiar conversation, a private joke, a quiet evening, the feeling of being understood without having to explain every emotion. These details can become significant precisely because they were never appreciated while they were available. The betrayal, then, was not necessarily the exact moment they lost you. The deeper loss began when they convinced themselves that losing you would have no lasting effect. They believed the relationship could be discarded without consequence because they were looking at the immediate relief rather than the emotional value of what they were leaving behind. They were thinking about escaping discomfort while you were losing trust. They were thinking about what came next while something meaningful was being permanently changed. And the hardest part is that they may only understand the difference later when the emotional distance that once protected them begins to feel like loneliness. When the person who always understood their silence is no longer there to understand it, silence can feel very different. When the person who gave them space finally stops waiting, space can begin to feel like absence. When the person who always left the door open finally closes it, the freedom they wanted can suddenly feel much heavier than they expected. One of the most painful parts of betrayal is watching the person who hurt you appear completely fine afterward. You may be sitting alone trying to understand what happened, replaying conversations, questioning your own judgment while they seem to continue with their life as though nothing significant occurred. They may become colder. They may stop responding with the same warmth. They may avoid serious conversations and act as though discussing the betrayal is an unnecessary burden. They may suddenly become extremely busy, fill their schedule with work or social activities, or direct their attention towards someone new. From your perspective, their behavior can feel almost impossible to understand. You may think, how can someone cause this much pain and then appear so unaffected? The answer can be more complicated than simply saying that they do not care. Avoidance does not always mean an absence of emotion. Sometimes it means distance from emotion. There is a significant difference between feeling nothing and learning how to move away from what you feel. A person experiences guilt, sadness, fear, longing, or even grief while having very little ability to sit with those emotions. Instead of processing the feeling, they may suppress it. Instead of talking about it, they may change the subject. Instead of admitting that they are hurt, they may convince themselves that they are simply relieved. This can help explain why an avoidant person may look unusually calm after a painful breakup or betrayal. Emotional distance can create a temporary sense of control. When the relationship becomes emotionally demanding, stepping away can reduce the immediate discomfort. The conversations stop, the expectations disappear, the difficult questions become easier to avoid. They may tell themselves that leaving was the right decision because admitting regret would force them to confront something far more uncomfortable. They may have hurt someone who genuinely loved them, so they create a story that makes the situation easier to live with. Perhaps they tell themselves that the relationship was already failing. Perhaps they focus on the moments when you needed reassurance and forget the countless moments when you offered understanding. Perhaps they emphasize your reactions while ignoring what caused those reactions. Perhaps they convince themselves that another person will make life easier. These explanations can provide emotional protection because they move attention away from responsibility and toward justification. This is also why they may appear colder after betrayal. Coldness can become a form of emotional armor. If they allow themselves to fully recognize the damage they caused, uncomfortable emotions can surface. Guilt can become difficult to escape. Regret can become difficult to silence. So rather than moving toward those emotions, they may move further away. They may become more distant precisely because closeness would force them to confront what they would rather avoid. They may also appear to move on remarkably quickly. A new relationship, constant social activity, work, entertainment, or endless distractions can provide something emotionally useful, noise. Silence gives difficult thoughts room to surface. Distraction keeps those thoughts at a distance. This does not automatically mean that every person who moves forward quickly is secretly suffering. People respond to relationships in different ways. But when emotional avoidance is already part of someone's coping style, distraction can become a powerful way of postponing emotional processing. there is another subtle pattern that can happen. The more strongly they convince themselves that they made the right decision, the more difficult it can become to admit that they were wrong. Admitting regret means admitting vulnerability. It means accepting that the person they betrayed mattered. It means acknowledging that their behavior had consequences. For someone uncomfortable with emotional dependence, that realization can feel threatening. So they may continue acting confident even when their inner experience is far more complicated. They did not necessarily feel nothing. They may simply have learned how to look like they felt nothing. Their silence may have been emotional suppression. Their distance may have been self-protection. Their busy schedule may have been distraction. Their sudden certainty may have been a way to avoid uncertainty. And while you were searching for evidence that they cared, they may have been working just as hard to avoid evidence that they still did. That is why their behavior after betrayal can feel so cruel. You are looking at their actions and assuming those actions reveal everything happening inside them. Yet human beings can become remarkably skilled at hiding emotional conflict, especially when vulnerability feels unsafe. A person can miss someone and refuse to contact them. A person can feel guilty and still avoid apologizing. A person can regret a decision and still defend it. A person can think about someone every day and still behave as though that person never mattered. And eventually, the distractions can become quieter. The relationship they used to compare everything against may become a memory. The new attention may stop feeling new. The busy days may become ordinary again. Then the emotions they pushed aside can become harder to keep away. The mind can return to the moments that were never properly processed, especially the moments where they had a chance to choose honesty and chose something else. That is when the emotional reality they avoided can begin appearing in places they never expected. At first, they may expect you to react exactly as you always did. They may expect anger, confrontation, repeated messages, emotional explanations, or another attempt to repair what was broken. They may believe that after the initial pain settles, you will reach out again. They may assume you will ask questions, demand answers, or try one more time to make them understand how deeply they hurt you. After all, they have seen you care before. They have seen you stay when things became difficult. They have experienced your patience when they pulled away. So when the betrayal happens, they may still carry an unconscious expectation that your love will eventually bring you back. Then something changes. You become quiet. You stop explaining yourself. You stop sending long messages trying to make sense of their behavior. You stop asking them to understand your pain. You stop looking for the perfect words that might finally make them recognize what they have done. There is no dramatic announcement. There is no endless argument. There is simply a gradual withdrawal of the emotional energy you once gave so freely. And because the change happens quietly, it can take time for them to understand what it means. This is where the emotional reversal begins. The person who was accustomed to having access to your attention suddenly finds that access disappearing. They may check their phone and realize you have not reached out. They may wonder why you are no longer asking questions. They may notice that you are no longer trying to repair something they helped break. At first, they may interpret your silence as temporary. They may think you are angry and will eventually calm down. They may believe you are waiting for them to make the first move. But as the days pass, your silence begins to communicate something far more powerful than argument could have communicated. You are no longer waiting for them. That realization can be unsettling because waiting had become part of the relationship. They may have grown accustomed to the idea that even when they created distance, you remained emotionally available. They could pull away and still know that you cared. They could become cold and still expect your warmth to remain. They could disappear into their own world and return later without fully understanding how much emotional effort it took for you to keep the connection alive. Your availability may have felt permanent simply because you had consistently offered it. Then permanence disappears. This does not mean you are using silence to punish them. It does not mean you are trying to manipulate their emotions or create jealousy. Healthy-ish emotional withdrawal is different from strategic silence. One is about protecting yourself after trust has been damaged. The other is about trying to control another person's response. When you stop explaining because you have finally accepted that the relationship is unsafe for your emotional well-being, your silence becomes an act of self-respect rather than revenge. And this can create a strange psychological experience for the person who betrayed you. They may have expected your anger, because anger still represents connection. An angry person is still emotionally engaged. An angry person is still trying to be heard. An angry person is still asking for something. Silence can communicate something different. It can suggest that the emotional negotiation has ended. There is no longer an argument to win because you have stopped participating in the argument. They may begin wondering whether you have finally detached. They may wonder whether someone else has entered your life. They may wonder whether you still think about them. They may even become curious about why you seem different. But the deeper change has little to do with what they think and everything to do with what has changed inside you. You are no longer measuring every decision according to whether it might bring them closer. You are no longer organizing your emotions around their availability. You are slowly taking your attention back. That is often when absence becomes real. While you were present, they could avoid fully recognizing your value because you were simply there. They could assume another conversation would happen. Another opportunity would appear. Another chance would come. Once you stop providing those opportunities, the relationship can no longer exist through your effort alone. They are left facing the space where your presence used to be. And then comes the question they may have never expected to confront. What happens when the person they were certain would always be there finally stops being available? The answer does not arrive through a dramatic confrontation. It arrives through ordinary moments, a memory they cannot share with you, a difficult day when they instinctively want to reach out, a familiar thought that reminds them of the person who once understood them, a moment when they realize that the door they assumed would remain open may have closed quietly, without hatred, without revenge, and without another explanation. At first, they may miss the obvious things: your voice, your presence, the conversations you used to have, the familiar routines that quietly became part of their life. But as time passes, something deeper can begin to surface. They may start missing the things they never fully appreciated while they had them. They may remember how easily you could understand their moods without demanding a detailed explanation. You noticed when something was wrong, even when they said everything was fine. You recognized the difference between their need for space and their desire to be abandoned. You knew when to come closer and when to give them room. At the time, these things may have felt ordinary to them. Later, they can become the very things that make your absence feel unusually difficult. They may remember how you listened. You did not always need to solve their problems. Sometimes you simply allowed them to speak. You gave them a place where they could lower their defenses without feeling judged. For someone who struggles with emotional vulnerability, that kind of acceptance can be more valuable than they realize. They may have years learning how to protect themselves from emotional exposure, only to encounter someone who did not force them open. You gave them space while still letting them know they mattered. You could remain close without demanding constant emotional performance. That balance can be difficult to find, and its value often becomes clearer after it disappears. They may also begin remembering the small changes you noticed, the change in their tone, the silence that lasted a little longer than usual, the difference between an ordinary bad day and something deeper. You paid attention to details they rarely explained. You understood pieces of them that they had learned to hide from other people. Perhaps they never had to tell you exactly why they were withdrawing because you already understood the pattern. Perhaps they could sit beside you without talking and still feel connected. That kind of silence is rare. It does not feel empty, it feels safe. And this is where something psychologically important can happen. A person may only recognize emotional safety after returning to environments where they have to protect themselves again. While you were present, your patience may have felt normal. Your forgiveness may have seemed endless. Your availability may have created the illusion that you would always remain accessible. They may have mistaken your patience for weakness because you did not punish every mistake. They may have mistaken your forgiveness for unlimited tolerance because you gave them another opportunity. They may have mistaken your availability for permanence because you had remained present through moments when others might have walked away. But patience has limits. Forgiveness has limits. Love has limits when trust is repeatedly damaged. Eventually, they may begin comparing the emotional experience of being with you to the experiences they have afterward. They may meet someone who does not understand their silence, someone who interprets distance as rejection, someone who responds to emotional withdrawal with pressure or conflict, someone who has no interest in patiently learning the hidden behind their behavior. And suddenly, qualities they once overlooked can become impossible to ignore. They may remember how you stayed through difficult moments. They may remember the times they were distant and you still treated them with compassion. They may remember conversations where you could have walked away but chose understanding instead. They may remember feeling accepted even when they were struggling to accept themselves. These memories can become more powerful because they are connected to a sense of emotional safety rather than simple romantic attraction. Sometimes people only recognize emotional safety after they return to a world where nobody knows how to make them feel safe. The person who once seemed overly patient may become the person they realize was remarkably understanding. The person they thought would always be available may become the person whose absence creates the greatest sense of loss. The person they assumed would forgive everything may become the person whose trust they can no longer access, and then the memories become more specific. They remember the way you looked at them when they were struggling, the way you could sit in silence without making the moment uncomfortable, the way you noticed what they needed before they knew how to ask for it, the way you made emotional closeness feel less threatening. These were never simply romantic gestures. They were experiences of being known. That is why losing someone who genuinely understood them can become very different from losing someone they simply dated. They may discover that attraction is easy to find, attention is easy to receive, and companionship can be replaced. Being deeply understood is different. Being accepted without being controlled is different. Having someone who respects your need for space while still remaining emotionally present is different. And once that kind of connection is gone, the things they once considered ordinary may become the memories they return to when everything else feels emotionally unfamiliar. After the betrayal, the avoidant may believe that the answer is simply finding someone different. Perhaps they tell themselves that the previous relationship was too difficult, too emotional, or too demanding. Perhaps they believe the next person will understand them better. Someone who asks fewer questions, someone who gives them more distance, someone who expects less emotional responsibility, someone who will never challenge them to talk about feelings they would rather keep hidden. In that moment, finding someone new can feel like proof that leaving was the right decision. A new relationship can create excitement, relief, and the comforting feeling that the problem has finally disappeared. Yet there is something they may slowly discover, changing the person beside you. does not automatically change the patterns you carry inside yourself. This is one of the lesser known realities of relationship behavior. People do not leave one relationship and suddenly become emotionally different human beings. The environment changes, the partner changes, the circumstances change. But the ways a person responds to closeness, vulnerability, conflict, and emotional pressure can continue appearing across relationships. If someone has learned to withdraw whenever intimacy becomes uncomfortable, another relationship can eventually activate that same response.
If someone has learned to suppress difficult emotions,
A new partner does not automatically teach them how to process those emotions. If someone experiences closeness as pressure, they may eventually feel that same pressure with someone else. At first, the new relationship can feel completely different because it has not yet reached the deeper stages of intimacy. There are fewer expectations, there is less history, there are fewer painful conversations. The person can present the version of themselves that feels easiest to manage. They can be charming, attentive, exciting, and emotionally available for a while because the relationship has not yet touched the places that previously triggered their defenses. But as emotional investment grows, deeper needs naturally appear. The new partner may eventually want reassurance, consistency, honesty, commitment, and vulnerability. Those needs can bring the same internal discomfort back to the surface. Then the avoidant may encounter a confusing realization. The new person is not necessarily the problem. The previous person was not necessarily the entire problem either. The pattern may have been following them. This does not mean every relationship will repeat in exactly the same way. Human behavior is more complicated than that. Attachment tendencies are patterns rather than permanent destinies. People can develop greater emotional awareness and learn healthier ways of relating. But meaningful change usually requires self-awareness. Without that work, changing partners can sometimes become a way of changing circumstances while leaving the underlying emotional strategy untouched. The person they betrayed may have been offering something the new relationship cannot simply reproduce. They may have understood their withdrawal without immediately turning it into rejection. They may have known when to give space and when to offer reassurance. They may have understood the history behind certain reactions. They may have seen the vulnerable person underneath the defensive behavior. A new partner can be kind, attractive, intelligent, and loving, yet still be unable to recreate the exact emotional history that existed in the previous relationship. This is where comparison can quietly begin. The avoidant may notice that the new person reacts differently. Maybe they become frustrated when communication suddenly stops. Maybe they ask for clarity. Maybe they expect accountability. Maybe they refuse to accept the emotional distance as the normal structure of the relationship. At first, the avoidant may see these differences as evidence that the new relationship is difficult. They may think, this person is too demanding. Yet the same complaint can appear in different forms across different relationships when the underlying response to intimacy remains unchanged. Research on attachment has consistently examined how avoidance relates to relationship functioning, including lower satisfaction and difficulties with intimacy.
the important point is that these patterns can influence how a person experiences relationships across time. The partner changes.
But the emotional reflex can familiar. When closeness begins to feel threatening, the same instinct to create distance can return. When conflict becomes emotionally intense, the same urge to escape can appear. When vulnerability becomes unavoidable, the same walls can rise again. And slowly, the fantasy of the perfect replacement can begin to disappear. The person they thought would make everything easier may eventually need the same honesty. The person they believed would require less emotional responsibility may eventually ask for consistency. The person they thought would never challenge them may eventually notice the same emotional distance. At that point, The avoidant may begin to understand something uncomfortable. The relationship was not the only problem. Their way of dealing with closeness had been part of the story too. And the new person, no matter how different they are, cannot build intimacy with a version of someone who is still running from the same emotions. At first, betrayal can create a strange sense of power for the person who caused it. They made a decision, stepped away from the emotional pressure, and suddenly they are from the confidence they did not want to have. They may feel lighter. They may tell themselves that they finally chose themselves. They may become busy with work, friends, entertainment, or another relationship. From the outside, it can look as though they escaped without paying an emotional price. But consequences do not always arrive at the moment a decision is made. Sometimes they arrive later, when the distractions become ordinary and there is finally enough silence for the mind to return to what was left unresolved. This is where emotional avoidance can become complicated. Avoiding a painful emotion can provide short-term relief. When guilt feels overwhelming, a person can push it away. When sadness becomes uncomfortable, they can stay busy. When regret appears, they can remind themselves why leaving was necessary. When memories become painful, they can focus on something else. These strategies can make difficult feelings quieter for a while. Yet pushing an emotion away is different from processing it. The feeling may become less visible without becoming fully resolved. Eventually, the distractions may lose their power. The new relationship may become familiar. The excitement of freedom may settle into ordinary life. The constant activity may slow down. And in those quieter moments, memories can begin returning. They may remember conversations they once dismissed. They may remember how patient you were when they were distant. They may remember moments when you trusted them and they chose to betray that trust. They may remember the expression on your face when you finally realized what had happened.
They may remember the last conversation, the final message.
Or the moment they understood that you were truly finished. Comparison can become part of this process. They may meet someone new and discover that the connection feels different. The new person may be wonderful, but the emotional history is different. They may notice that certain things that felt ordinary with you are absent now. The new person may not understand their silence in the same way. They may not know the stories behind their fears. They may not recognize the subtle changes in their mood. They may not have the patience that developed through years of knowing them. Slowly, the person they once took for granted can become a reference point in their emotional memory. Then guilt can appear in a different form. Early guilt may have been easy to suppress because they were focused on escaping the situation. Later guilt can become harder to dismiss because they have had time to see the consequences. They may begin asking themselves questions they avoided before. Why did I do that? Why did I risk something meaningful? Why did I assume they would stay? Why did I believe another person would solve the problem? Why did I choose temporary relief over long-term trust? Those questions can create emotional confusion. A person can believe that leaving was necessary and still regret the way they handled the relationship. They can miss you while knowing that returning would require accountability. They can feel lonely while still being afraid of emotional closeness. They can recognize that they hurt you while struggling to admit it directly. Human emotions rarely follow a clean sequence, especially when someone has spent years learning to move away from uncomfortable feelings. There may also be moments when memories appear unexpectedly, a familiar place, a particular song, a phrase you used to say, a routine you shared, a difficult day when they instinctively remember the person who once offered comfort. These moments can bring the past into the present without warning. The mind does not simply erase emotional history because a relationship has ended. Certain experiences remain connected to people, places, routines, and feelings. And this is where the betrayal can begin following them emotionally. It is no longer just something that happened in the past. It becomes part of the way they understand their own choices. They may start recognizing that the relationship they wanted to escape was also a relationship that offered genuine emotional security. They may recognize that their behavior did not simply end a connection. It changed the way another person saw them forever. The person who once trusted them now has a reason to protect themselves from them. That realization can be difficult because there is no easy way to reverse it. An apology cannot automatically restore trust. Missing someone cannot undo betrayal. Regret cannot return the exact version of the relationship that existed before the damage. The person may eventually understand that the consequences were not created by your decision to leave. They began with the decision that made staying emotionally impossible. And the more clearly they see that connection, the harder it becomes to hide from the emotional weight of what they chose. The hardest part of betrayal may arrive long after the relationship has ended. It may come when the distractions become quieter and the person finally has to sit with their own choices. Losing you can hurt, but there can be something even more difficult than the loss itself. It is the realization that they had something real in front of them, something built through trust, patience, shared experiences, vulnerability, and emotional connection, and they damaged it through a choice they cannot simply erase. There is a particular kind of regret that comes from knowing the outcome could have been different if you had been treated differently. They may begin remembering the opportunities they had to choose another path. There were moments when honesty was possible, moments when they could have admitted that they were struggling.
Moments when they could have asked for space instead of creating distance through betrayal. Moments when they could have told you
The truth before the truth became something you discovered on your own. At the time, those choices may have seemed small. Later, each one can become part of a larger memory. They may look back and realize that the relationship did not collapse in a single moment. It was changed through a series of decisions. They may remember the trust you gave them. Trust is often invisible while it exists because it does not demand attention. You trusted their words. You trusted their intentions. You believed the relationship had a level of safety that allowed both of you to be vulnerable. They may remember moments when you shared fears, private thoughts, personal experiences, or parts of yourself that you rarely showed other people. Those memories can become painful because vulnerability carries an unspoken request. Handle this part of me carefully. Betrayal answers that vulnerability with the opposite message. They may also remember how you treated them when they were struggling. Perhaps you gave them patience when they were distant. Here's the terrifying truth. Perhaps you allowed them to have difficult days without immediately making them prove their love. Perhaps you listened when they could barely explain what they were feeling. Perhaps you saw the insecurity behind their defensiveness and responded with compassion. These moments can become difficult to forget because they reveal what the relationship actually contained beneath the arguments and misunderstanding. Then
There is the exact moment they crossed the line.
people can spend a long time avoiding that memory, especially when remembering it forces them to accept responsibility. They may remember what they were thinking. They may remember what they told themselves to justify the decision. They may remember how easily they convinced themselves that the consequences would be manageable. Perhaps they believed you would eventually forgive them. Perhaps they believed the relationship had already become too damaged to save. Perhaps they simply wanted immediate relief from emotional discomfort. Whatever explanation they used at the time, the result remains, and eventually they may understand something that changes the entire meaning of your departure. You did not necessarily leave because you stopped loving them. You left because betrayal changed what love could safely look like. Love can survive disagreements. Love can survive difficult conversations. Love can survive imperfections. But trust cannot survive repeated violations without consequences. There comes a point where staying requires you to ignore your own emotional safety, and leaving becomes an act of self-respect. This can be a painful realization for the person who caused the betrayal because it removes the comforting idea that you simply abandoned them. They may have wanted to believe that you left because you were too emotional, too unforgiving, or unwilling to understand them. But eventually, they may see the connection between their choices and your decision. They created the wound, and you eventually stopped standing in front of it. Sometimes the person you hurt becomes the person you can never reach again. That realization can feel heavier than an angry goodbye because anger still contains engagement. Anger says there is something left to discuss.
Silence can say the emotional relationship has already ended. They may want to explain themselves after you have stopped needing an explanation.
They may want to apologize after you have learned to live. They may finally understand your value after you stopped measuring your worth through their eyes. And this is where the psychological meaning of the title becomes deeper. Their life is not ruined because you chose to punish them. It becomes more complicated because their own choices may force them to confront something they spent years avoiding. They have to live with the knowledge that someone genuinely loved them, trusted them, understood them, and gave them opportunities to be honest. Yet they chose a path that made that connection impossible to return to in its original form. The memory of losing you may fade in intensity over time, but the lesson can remain. Sometimes the greatest consequence of betrayal is not losing the person in front of you. It is becoming the person who knows exactly why that person had to leave. Your absence can feel different because your value was never measured by how much you chased someone. It came from what you brought into their life while you were there. You offered emotional patience when their defenses appeared. You tried to understand the silence behind their behavior instead of immediately judging it. You remained consistent when their emotions became inconsistent. You created a space where vulnerability could exist without becoming a weapon. These qualities can become so familiar that the person receiving them stops recognizing how rare they are. They simply become part of everyday life, something expected rather than appreciated. You may have been the person who knew how to approach them without overwhelming them. You understood that sometimes they need space, but you also knew that space did not have to mean emotional abandonment. You could give them room while still communicating that they mattered. That balance is difficult to create. It requires patience, emotional awareness, and a willingness to understand another person's inner world without losing yourself inside it. When that disappears, the absence can feel different because it is more than the absence of companionship. It is the absence of a particular emotional environment. They may eventually meet someone who is attractive, intelligent, caring, and interesting. That person may bring wonderful qualities into their life. Yet, their new relationship will recreate the exact combination of trust, history, trust, acceptance, and understanding that existed with you. Relationships are built through thousands of small interactions. The private language between two people develops over time. Certain looks, habits, routines, memories, and emotional patterns become meaningful because they belong to that particular connection. A new person can create something beautiful, but they cannot simply copy the history that already existed. This is also why your absence should never become a performance. You do not need to disappear so that someone becomes desperate. You do not need to post your happiness to make someone jealous. You do not need to make them wonder where you are every hour of the day. Those strategies keep your attention tied to the same person you are trying to move away from. Real emotional distance is different. It happens when you stop organizing your life around their reaction. You stop asking whether they miss you. You stop checking whether they regret what happened. You stop needing their pain to prove that your pain mattered. The healthier goal is not to make the avoidant suffer. The healthier goal is to stop measuring your worth by whether the person who betrayed you regrets losing you. Their regret is information about their experience. It is not a measurement of your value. Their silence does not make you less important. Their new relationship does not erase what you gave. Their failure to apologize does not mean your pain was insignificant. Their inability to recognize your value does not mean you lacked value. There is tremendous emotional freedom in understanding this distinction. You can acknowledge that someone may eventually miss you without waiting for that moment. You can recognize that they may regret their choices without building your healing around their regret. You can understand that your absence may affect them deeply while still choosing to protect your peace. Their emotional journey belongs to them. Your healing belongs to you. Perhaps the most powerful change happens when you stop asking, will they realize what they lost? And begin asking, why did I ever believe someone else had to recognize my value before I could recognize it myself? That question changes the direction of the entire story. You are no longer waiting for their emotional awakening. You are developing your own. The qualities you brought into the relationship remain valuable even after the relationship ends. Your patience is still valuable. Your ability to understand is still valuable. Your consistency is still valuable. Your capacity for vulnerability is still valuable. Your willingness to create emotional safety is still valuable. The difference is that these qualities no longer have to be offered to someone who treats them as something guaranteed. You can carry those qualities forward without carrying the betrayal with you. You can remain compassionate without remaining available to someone who repeatedly damages your trust. You can understand why someone behaved the way they did without excusing what they did. You can love someone from a distance and still choose a life where their behavior no longer controls your emotional state. And sometimes that is why your absence feels so different. You are no longer standing in the same place, waiting to be chosen. You are no longer trying to convince someone that the connection deserves protection. You are no longer offering endless explanations for why their actions hurt you. You have stepped outside the cycle.
And when someone becomes accustomed to your presence,
And your emotional availability, the moment those things are no longer freely given, can reveal something they could never see while you were standing right beside them. There may come a moment when the person who betrayed you reaches out again. Perhaps they send a simple message asking how you are. Perhaps they suddenly become nostalgic and mention an old memory that only the two of you would understand. Perhaps they apologize for what happened. Perhaps they test the emotional distance between you by sending something casual, almost as though they are trying to discover whether the door is still open. After everything you have been through, that moment can feel powerful. You may wonder whether they finally understand. You may wonder whether their return means they have changed. But this is where emotional clarity becomes essential, because returning and changing are two completely different things. Someone can miss your presence without being ready to rebuild a healthy relationship. They can feel lonely without understanding why the relationship became unhealthy. They can regret losing you without fully accepting responsibility for the choices that caused the loss. They can become nostalgic because they miss the comfort you provided, while still struggling with the emotional patterns that made closeness difficult in the first place. Human beings can deeply miss someone and still be unable to give that person what they need. This is especially important after betrayal. A message does not restore trust. An apology does not immediately repair emotional safety. A declaration of love does not erase the memory of being betrayed. Words can open a conversation, but behavior determines whether anything meaningful has actually changed. If they return saying they have changed, the important question is not how emotional their words sound. The important question is whether their behavior has become different over time. Missing you is not the same as being ready for you. They may miss your voice, your attention, your patience, your companionship, or the emotional safety they experienced around you. But being ready for you requires something deeper. It requires the ability to tolerate uncomfortable conversations without escaping. It requires honesty when honesty is difficult. It requires accepting responsibility without immediately defending themselves. It requires understanding that your boundaries are not attacks. It requires consistency even when the relationship becomes emotionally challenging. Regretting losing you is also different from understanding why they betrayed you. Regret can come from experiencing the consequences. Understanding requires self-examination. They would need to look honestly at their decisions and recognize the emotional patterns behind them. They would need to ask why they created distance when closeness became uncomfortable. They would need to understand why immediate relief became more important than long-term trust. They would need to recognize how their actions affected another person's ability to feel emotionally safe with them. Wanting you back is not the same as becoming capable of treating you differently.
This distinction can protect you from getting trapped in the same cycle twice. Someone may return because the relationship they expected to find elsewhere did
Not provide what they hoped for. They may return because loneliness became stronger than their desire for distance. They may return because they finally recognize your value. Yet none of those reasons automatically mean they have developed the emotional skills required to sustain intimacy. Real change usually becomes visible through repeated behavior. They communicate instead of disappearing. They acknowledge your feelings without making you responsible for theirs. They accept boundaries without trying to break them. They become willing to discuss painful subjects instead of escaping them. They stop asking for trust and begin behaving in ways that gradually make trust possible again. They understand that forgiveness cannot be demanded and access to your life is no longer guaranteed. There may also be a difference in the way they handle your boundaries after returning. A person who has genuinely grown can hear you say that you need time without treating your boundary as rejection. They can accept that you are cautious because their actions created that caution. They do not pressure you to move on simply because they are ready to reconnect. They understand that rebuilding trust belongs to both people, and the person who broke it has a responsibility to demonstrate consistency. This is why their return should never become the reward you were waiting for. You do not need their message to prove that you mattered. You do not need their apology to validate what happened. You do not need their regret to confirm that they made a mistake. If they return, the question becomes much more important than whether they still have feelings. The question becomes whether they have become emotionally capable of giving you the kind of relationship their previous behavior made impossible. Because coming back is easy when loneliness speaks loudly. Changing is harder. Changing requires accountability when nobody is watching. It requires emotional awarenesses when old defenses appear. It requires different choices when the same fears return. And eventually, that is what separates a temporary return from genuine transformation. For a long time, your attention may have been focused almost entirely on the person who betrayed you. You may have spent hours trying to understand their behavior, searching for the reason they pulled away, wondering why they could say they cared and still make choices that cause so much pain. You may have replayed conversations and looked for the moment when everything changed. You may have wondered whether you could communicated differently, loved them better, given them more space, or been more patient. Betrayal can create a strange kind of mental loop where the person who caused the wound becomes the center of your attention. Then something begins to shift. You start noticing your own behavior in the relationship. You remember how many chances you gave. You Remember the conversations where you explained your feelings again and again, hoping that the right words would finally make them understand. You remember moments when you carried the emotional responsibility for both people. When they became distant, you tried to repair the connection. When they became defensive, you tried to calm the situation. When they withdrew, you tried to understand. When they became uncertain, you tried to provide reassurance. Slowly, you may realize that you were doing emotional work that belonged to two people. This realization can be painful because your patience may have been one of the things you were proud of. You may have believed that loving someone meant giving them time, giving them room, understanding their fears, forgiving their mistakes, waiting for them to become comfortable with intimacy, waiting for them to become ready. There is nothing wrong with patience itself. The problem begins when patience requires you to repeatedly abandon your own emotional needs. There's a difference between understanding someone's wounds and allowing those wounds to repeatedly wound you. You can understand why someone struggles with closeness without accepting betrayal. You can recognize their fears without becoming responsible for healing them. You can give someone space without accepting emotional neglect. You can love someone deeply without waiting forever for them to become capable of giving you a healthy relationship. This is where the question begins to change. Instead of asking only, why did they do this? You begin asking, why was I willing to keep accepting it? That question can feel uncomfortable because it brings the focus back to you. It does not mean you caused their betrayal. Their choices remain their responsibility. It means you are beginning to examine the boundaries you allowed, the chances you gave, and the moments when you ignored your own discomfort because you hoped the relationship would eventually become what you wanted it to be. You may remember how often you explained yourself. You explained why certain behavior hurt you. You explained why communication mattered. You explained why disappearing was painful. You explained why trust needed to be protected. You may have believed that if they could simply understand your perspective, they would finally choose differently. But there comes a point when repeated explanations stop creating understanding and start becoming emotional exhaustion. Then another realization can appear. You were waiting for someone to become ready while your own life was continuing. You were waiting for them to become comfortable with vulnerability, waiting for them to communicate, waiting for them to choose you without hesitation, waiting for them to understand the value of what they had. During that waiting, you may have placed your emotional life on hold. Healing begins when the waiting starts to end. You stop organizing your future around someone else's potential. You stop loving the version of them you hope they will become more than the person they consistently show you. You stop confusing potential with reality. You begin paying attention to behavior instead of promises. This does not require becoming cold. It does not require losing your compassion. You can still understand why an avoidant person behaves the way they do. You cannot recognize that fear, attachment history, and emotional defenses can influence in relationships. But understanding becomes healthier when it no longer requires self-abandonment. You begin learning that boundaries are not punishments. Saying enough is enough does not make you cruel. Walking away from betrayal does not mean you failed to love someone. Refusing to accept the same behavior again does not erase the good memories. It simply means your emotional safety has become important too. And slowly, the story becomes less about whether they will regret losing you and more about whether you will regret losing yourself trying to keep them. That is a different kind of awakening. You begin to understand that your worth was never determined by their ability to recognize it. Your healing does not depend on their apology, their return, or their realization. It begins when you finally stop abandoning yourself in the hope that someone else will stop abandoning you. The deepest consequence of betrayal is rarely the simple fact that a relationship ended. A relationship can end for countless reasons. People grow apart, circumstances change. Two people can discover that they want different things. But betrayal forces a person to confront the connection between their choices and the loss that follows. The real consequence may be that they eventually have to look at a pattern they spent years avoiding. They may have believed that emotional distance protected them from pain, yet their attempt to escape vulnerability may have cost them the very connection that made vulnerability feel safe. They may lose your trust first. Trust is built quietly through consistency. It develops when someone's words repeatedly match their actions. It grows when a person feels safe enough to reveal their fears, weaknesses, and private thoughts without expecting those things to be used against them. Once betrayal enters the relationship, that sense of safety changes. Even if love remains, trust may no longer have the same foundation. They may eventually realize that your doubts were not unreasonable. Your hesitation was not cruelty. Your boundaries were a natural response to what happened. They may also lose emotional safety. This can be one of the hardest consequences to understand because emotional safety is rarely visible while it exists. You may have created a space where they could be quiet without being judged. You may have allowed them to express difficult emotions without immediately demanding solutions. You may have understood their need for space while still making them feel cared for. They may have taken those experiences for granted because they were familiar. After the relationship ends, they may discover that emotional safety cannot simply be ordered, demanded, or replaced. Then there is intimacy. Genuine intimacy requires more than attraction. It requires trust, vulnerability, honesty, and the willingness to be emotionally present. A person can find another partner quickly and still struggle to recreate the depth that existed in a previous relationship. They can receive attention from someone new while still missing the person who understood the parts of them that rarely appeared in public. They may eventually discover that physical closeness and emotional intimacy are very different experiences. Their credibility may change too. Once someone knows that you betrayed their trust, the way they see your promises changes. Words that once felt reassuring can begin to feel uncertain. Even sincere statements may be questioned because the foundation underneath them has been damaged. That can be painful for the person who caused the betrayal because they may eventually realize that simply saying, "Just trust me," is no longer enough. Trust has to be rebuilt through behavior, consistency, and time. And then there is access. They may lose access to someone who genuinely loved them, someone who knew their complicated sides and still tried to understand them, someone who gave them opportunities to communicate when silence would have been easier, someone who wanted honesty more than perfection. That kind of person cannot simply be replaced by finding someone new and starting over. Every relationship has its own history. Every emotional connection has its own language. Every person brings qualities that cannot be duplicated exactly. This is where they may finally understand the difference between being loved and being given unlimited permission to hurt someone. You may have accepted their imperfections. You may have understood their fears. You may have tolerated moments of distance. You may have given them room to grow. But you were never asking them to be perfect. You were asking them to be honest. You were asking them to tell you when they were struggling. You were asking them to communicate before making decisions that could destroy trust. You were asking them to respect the emotional bond that existed between you. You were asking for basic honesty, because honesty gives two people a chance to make informed choices about their relationship. And perhaps that becomes the most uncomfortable realization of all. The relationship may have survived their fear. It may have survived their need for space. It may have survived difficult conversations. It may even have survived emotional distance if there had been honesty underneath it. But betrayal
changed the rules because it removed the ability to be emotionally safe with the person they were supposed to trust.
So the real consequence may never be simply that they lost you. The deeper consequence is that they may have to live with the knowledge that their attempt to avoid emotional discomfort created a much greater form of emotional loss. They may eventually understand that the person standing in front of them was never demanding perfection. You were asking for honesty, consistency, and respect.
You were asking for a relationship where both people
Could feel safe enough to tell the truth.
and once that truth becomes clear, the loss can take on a different meaning.
They did not lose someone because you expected too much. They lost someone because they failed to protect something that required very little perfection and a great deal of honesty. The avoidant had no idea what the betrayal would truly cost. They thought they were ending a relationship. They thought they were creating distance from something that had become uncomfortable. They may have believed that you would eventually return, that another conversation would happen, that another chance would appear, or that someone else could fill the space you left behind. But sometimes the greatest loss is only understood after the person is no longer available to return. They were not simply losing a romantic partner. They were losing access to someone who genuinely knew them, someone who understood their silence, someone who gave them space without abandoning them, someone who offered patience, trust, acceptance, and emotional safety. They were losing a future that could have continued to grow if honesty and accountability had been chosen instead of betrayal. And perhaps they eventually realized that another person could be wonderful and still never recreate the exact history you shared. Nobody else carries your memories with them. Nobody else knows the same version of them that you knew. Nobody else can recreate every conversation, every quiet moment, every difficult season, or every time you stayed when leaving would have been easier. They thought avoiding the pain would protect them. But emotional avoidance can only take a person so far. Eventually, the distractions become quieter, the memories become clearer, the consequences become harder to explain away, and they may have to face the truth they once tried to escape. Losing you was connected to choices they made themselves. But there is something even more important for you to understand. You were never supposed to spend your life proving that you were worth choosing. You were never supposed to convince someone to appreciate your loyalty. You were never supposed to keep explaining why honesty mattered. You were never supposed to abandon your own emotional safety while waiting for someone else to become ready. The person who betrayed you may eventually understand your value. They may regret what they did. They may miss you. They may even wish they could go back and make different choices. But your healing begins when their realization is no longer required, because the real victory is not watching them regret losing you. The real victory is reaching a place where their regret no longer determines your peace. You do not need to see them suffer to know that you mattered. You do not need their apology to know that your pain was real. You do not need them to come back to prove that you were unforgettable. Your worth existed before they recognized it, and it remains after they are gone. So yes, the avoidant had no idea betraying you would ruin their life, but the deeper truth is that their life was not ruined because you left. Their old way of loving simply stopped working once you stopped participating in it. And while they may eventually be forced to confront what they lost, you get the opportunity to build something they could not take away from you. A life where love does not require you to abandon yourself. A life where honesty is expected. A life where trust is protected. A life where emotional safety matters. A life where you no longer wait for someone to decide whether you are worthy of being chosen. You choose yourself. And that is where your life finally begins again. If this message connected with something you have experienced, take a moment to like this video. Your support helps this channel reach more people who may need to hear these words. And if you want more videos about attachment, emotional healing, relationships, and the psychology behind human behavior, subscribe to our channel and stay with us for the next video. You are not here to chase someone who could not recognize your value. You are here to understand yourself, heal, and become free from the patterns that once made you question your worth.